hungry black boy came to ask for food at the home of a paralyzed white billionaire and told him he could heal his legs. The billionaire smiled gently at what he thought was just a child's joke, but no one knew that everything was truly about to change in ways no one could have imagined. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. A wealthy 52-year-old white man, Richard Caldwell, sat in still solitude in his magnificent yet frigid manner on a November evening, gazing out at the broad expanse of rain-soaked land. Heavy drops descended gently, swirling in the faint amber light, blanketing the grand but silent estate in a glossy sheen, like a fortress cut off from the world. The immense, splendid living area, once intended for lively chatter and gatherings, now stood eerily quiet. Richard remained unmoving in his luxurious wheelchair, the emotionless contraption that had replaced his legs for the past 15 grueling years. His eyes were hollow and unfocused as he peered through the glass, his thoughts drifting to distant memories of a life once brimming with delight and expectation. He recalled that fateful day, a decade and a half ago, when a vehicle collision irrevocably stole his capacity to walk. Before then, Richard had been a formidable, driven individual admired by associates and business partners alike. He possessed everything: vast riches, soaring renown, and his lovely wife, Deborah Caldwell, by his side. But the accident transformed everything. In the days following his realization that his legs would never recover, friends and colleagues still visited frequently, yet their concerns swiftly diminished once they understood Richard had lost his influence and power. Phone calls dwindled, social engagements became scarce, then ceased entirely, leaving him in the deepest solitude. He gradually comprehended that in the superficial world he'd inhabited, people cared only for their own interests, and no one truly shared another's suffering. Even worse, the woman he had loved beyond measure abandoned him. Deborah, who had once accompanied him to extravagant festivities, decided to divorce after 3 years of enduring the bitterness and resentment he directed at her daily. She claimed she could no longer bear the animosity and coldness in his gaze each time she attempted to assist him. When Deborah departed, Richard felt as though his final connection to the world had severed. His eyes no longer shed tears. Only boundless emptiness and a chilling void remained. Then his mother, Eleanor Caldwell, the sole person who had endeavored to stay in touch, also grew distant. Each of her visits was marked by a deeper look of sorrow and helplessness in her aged eyes. As she watched her only son retreat further into gloom, she urged him to reconnect, to discover new joys. But Richard's stubborn pride built an invisible barrier between him and the woman who had birthed and nurtured him for so many years. Her visits grew sparse, and now they were little more than brief, awkward phone calls filled with painful silences. Richard sighed softly, his gaze sweeping the dim room. The priceless artworks on the walls and the lavish furnishings no longer stirred anything in him but bitterness and emptiness. He had once believed money could acquire anything, but now he understood that no fortune could purchase an understanding heart, a comforting hand, or genuine affection. He recalled the sensation of walking on his own 2 feet, something he had dreamed of experiencing again for 15 years. He loathed himself for his helplessness, despised the meaningless existence he led, and more than once had contemplated ending it all. Yet he'd never found the bravery to let go, so he remained like a silent specter wandering a world too vast for him. A cold draft slipped through a gap in the door, making him shiver despite the room's warmth. Richard wondered if his life could ever change. Did wonders truly exist, or were they just fabrications he once believed in his youth? In the terrifying quiet, he suddenly heard a soft rapping at the servant's side entrance. He startled and glanced at the clock on the wall. Well past midnight. Who could arrive at this hour? His only remaining housekeeper, Clara, had long since retired for the night. At first, he wished to disregard the knocking. Nothing could pull him from the self-imposed solitude he'd embraced. But the tapping persisted, gentle, yet insistent, as if attempting to awaken something profound within his spirit. With a sigh, curiosity prevailed. He slowly propelled his wheelchair down the long, dark corridor, past cold rooms filled with sad memories. When he reached the door, his heart began to pound, a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He opened it slowly. Standing before him was a tiny boy, his dark complexion striking against the faint porch light. His attire was ragged, and his big, bright eyes looked up at him, full of hope. "Mister," His small voice rang out in the freezing night. "I'm so hungry, do you have any leftovers you could spare?" Richard froze, completely captivated by the sincerity in those eyes, unaware that his lonely, frozen world was about to transform forever, beginning with this tiny moment. Richard froze, caught completely in the sincerity shining in his eyes. The pale, amber porch light softly illuminated his delicate face, accentuating the smooth ebony of his skin against the bone-cutting cold of the winter night. He stood there, shivering, his wide, clear brown eyes fixed on him without a hint of fear or hesitation. Richard cleared his throat softly, trying to mask his surprise and embarrassment. He was used to the wary glances and evasive looks people gave when they saw his extravagant wheelchair, but the boy before him seemed oblivious to his disabled legs, unafraid to stand before a wealthy white man. "Did you say something?" Richard asked, his voice gentler than he'd intended. The boy gently brushed his tangled, rain-dusted curls aside and looked up at him, his voice trembling but clear. "I'm so hungry. Do you have any leftovers?" Richard felt a sharp pang in his heart at those genuine words. How long had it been since someone spoke to him with such simplicity and honesty? How long since anyone saw him as a person rather than his money or his crippled legs? He studied him more closely. He wore a thin jacket fraying at the cuffs, with one pocket torn, revealing the thin fabric beneath. His worn shoes with visible scuffs allowed his small toes to peek out, his skin ashen from the freezing air, an image that stirred an inexplicable ache in him. Instinctively, he wondered how a little boy like this could be wandering alone in the rainy night, coming to a stranger's home to beg for food. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone softening with concern he didn't quite understand. "Julian Thomas," he replied without hesitation, his small voice carrying a surprising confidence that belied his worn appearance. Richard nodded slowly. "Do you live nearby?" "Yes, sir. My mom and I live in a modest duplex nearby. She often works very late," Julian said, pointing toward the dilapidated row of buildings opposite his manor. Richard turned to look where he pointed. He realized he'd been so isolated that he'd never noticed the impoverished apartments just steps from his estate. A flush of shame rose in him. How selfishly he'd lived. "Then why didn't you wait for your mother to come home and eat together?" he asked gently. "My mom manages multiple jobs. Some nights she gets home very late. Today, our kind neighbor said rich people always throw away good food, so I thought I'd ask you," Julian explained, matter-of-factly, as though his actions were perfectly ordinary. Richard's chest ached at his blunt honesty. He fell silent for a moment, watching the little boy shiver. Then, without hesitation, he opened the door wider. "Come inside. I'll get you something to eat." Julian stepped into the house, tentatively, his eyes widening at the opulence around him. Expensive treasures stretched out before him like a whole new world. Yet Richard was most surprised by his lack of greed or envy. Only a childlike curiosity glowed in his gaze. He led Julian into the kitchen and retrieved a platter of uneaten food. He accepted it with deep gratitude, but instead of digging in, Julian looked up at him earnestly. "Do you want me to help you?" he asked. Richard chuckled softly. "What could a little boy like you possibly do?" "I can help you walk again," Julian said with utter seriousness, fully believing his own words. Richard's smile vanished, his eyes flashing annoyance. Surely he was mocking him. He was about to refuse outright, but the clear sincerity in his innocent gaze stayed his tongue. There was no trace of ridicule. He truly believed he could help him. "Are you joking?" he asked, fighting to remain calm. "No, I'm not joking," Julian answered firmly. "My mother always tells me that genuine compassion and affection can mend anything. If you help me not be hungry, I'll surely be able to help you." Richard looked into his eyes again and saw nothing but purity and sincerity. He remembered the countless doctors, renowned specialists, and costly treatments he'd pursued over 15 years, all to no avail. How could this little boy do what the entire medical world had failed to do? Yet something in Julian's unwavering faith stirred a spark of hope in him, something he hadn't felt in years. "All right," he whispered. "I'll agree, but only because you're hungry and cold. Not because I believe in the wonders you speak of." Julian beamed his smile, the first warmth that had touched Richard's icy heart in years. Outside, the rain continued to fall heavily. But for the first time in 15 years, Richard felt something shift within him. And it all began with a strange little black boy on his doorstep on a freezing winter night. As the door closed behind Julian, Richard remained motionless in the vast living room, holding the small drawing he had just given him. He gently traced its crude, slightly smudged lines, and yet there was a strange beauty in it, the beauty of a genuine gratitude he had long since forgotten. Richard sighed. For the first time in years, he felt a rare lightness in his chest. The next morning, when Clara, his longtime housekeeper, arrived for work, Richard decided to tell her about the strange encounter the night before. He'd always trusted Clara. She'd worked for his family since he was a child and had cared for him through his hardest days, so he was taken aback by her reaction. "You can't trust a random child like that, especially a little black boy from that run-down neighborhood," Clara said sternly. "Who knows what he and his mother want? Maybe they know you're rich and want to exploit your kindness." Richard frowned, offended by Clara's harsh words. He knew she held old-fashioned prejudices, but he'd never felt so irritated. Deep inside, a protective urge for Julian stirred. "Clara, he's only 7 years old. I found him completely sincere," Richard replied softly. "Sincere?" Clara scoffed, her eyes narrow with distrust. "Richard, how many people have taken advantage of your wealth? Don't let yourself make that mistake again." Richard fell silent. Her words stung, but they also made him question. Had he been too naive and trusting that afternoon? A familiar knock sounded at the door again. Richard opened it swiftly to find Julian standing there, his little face radiant like a winter sunrise. "Hello, Mr. Caldwell," he called cheerfully, offering him another small drawing wrapped carefully in old newspaper. "I came back to say thank you. This is the wonder of gratitude." Richard smiled, and all his worries seemed to disappear when he saw the clear light in his eyes. He accepted the drawing with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Julian," he said gently. "This truly is a beautiful gift." Julian beamed, then suddenly asked, his tone serious. "Mr. Caldwell, your legs must hurt a lot, right? How long has it been since you could walk?" Richard was momentarily taken aback by his straightforward question, but his sincerity disarmed him. He couldn't refuse. "Yes, Julian. I was injured many years ago. The doctors say I'll never walk again. But the doctors don't know everything, do they?" Julian said softly as he stepped closer. "May I briefly touch your leg?" Richard hesitated, then nodded. Julian moved forward and placed his tiny hand on his knee. In that instant, he felt an unusual current ripple through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 15 years. It wasn't a clear sensation in his legs, but rather a peaceful warmth spreading through his heart, as if his small hand had reached the deepest part of his soul. He looked down at him, eyes wide with curiosity. "Why are you doing this, Julian?" "I'm sending love and faith to your legs," he replied earnestly, his eyes shining. "My mother always says that if you truly believe and love, wonders can happen." Richard studied him closely. In that moment, he realized Julian was not just a needy child, but a beautiful soul capable of touching the darkest corners of his heart. He saw him now, not with pity or curiosity, but with respect and profound gratitude. Standing tall, Julian looked up at him with unwavering conviction. "Mr. Caldwell, the wonder has already begun. All you need to do is believe." After he left, Richard sat alone, gazing at the little drawing Julian had given him. He wondered if he'd been wrong to cling to his prejudices. Perhaps Clara's harsh words weren't absolute truth, but the product of age-old biases. In his heart, those prejudices began to crack, and for the first time in 15 years, he resolved not to let them obscure the truth any longer. He was ready just a little bit to let hope and humanity's light into his dark world. When Julian left the little drawing still resting in Richard's hand, emotions he'd never felt before stirring in his soul. A cold gust of wind swept against the window pane, carrying with it a vague sense of unease. Inside, Richard's long-held prejudices began to crack, but the world outside remained full of prying eyes, suspicion, and the hidden dangers that a black boy like Julian or anyone from a vulnerable community faced every day. That evening, in a pitch-dark duplex nearby, Martha Thomas, Julian's mother, returned home after a long shift. Though she was just over 30, her face was etched with fatigue, and her eyes carried a constant weariness. Life as a single mother raising her child in a poor neighborhood surrounded by subtle bias and discrimination had forged in Martha a tough resilience, but also an undercurrent of perpetual anxiety. "Mama, I did exactly what Mrs. Patterson told me," Julian exclaimed, holding out the container of leftovers he'd gotten from Richard's house. Martha looked at it in surprise. Her son's joyous eyes softened her heart, but panic quickly followed. "Where did you get this? I told you not to wander around after dark, Julian, especially to strangers' houses. Don't you realize how dangerous that is?" Martha hugged him tightly, her voice trembling with fear. "But he was so nice, Mama. Mr. Caldwell gave me food and he actually listened to me. He's nothing like other white people," Julian said, simply unaware of the worry swelling in his mother's chest. Martha froze. "Richard." She tried to stay calm, but horrific stories of racial exploitation, wealthy men preying on children of color rushed to her mind like a fierce wave. She thought of so many black families who'd been wrongly suspected, forced to protect their own children from scornful stares, cruel taunts, or even real threats from those pretending to be kind. "Tell me about him, Julian," Martha said, sitting down and scrutinizing every small reaction of her son. Julian eagerly described the silver-haired man in the wheelchair at the Grand Manor, who had given him food and listened to his small dreams. But when he casually mentioned the wonder of helping him walk again, Martha's panic only grew. "Are you sure he didn't do anything to scare you? Did he touch you or ask weird questions?" Martha pressed her voice, hardening with both worry and anger at the thought of her child being taken advantage of. "No, he only let me touch his leg. His legs haven't worked in so long. Mama, I just wanted to help him feel less lonely," Julian replied softly, sensing his mother's distress. Martha pulled him even closer, her heart a swirl of conflicting emotions. Love for her son, sorrow for the dangers black children face, and an overwhelming fear of a world she couldn't control. Finally, she stood silently determined to confront Richard and protect her boy at all costs. The next morning, just as Richard was finishing breakfast, a rapid knock came at the door. When he opened it, he found a slender black woman with fierce eyes, Martha Thomas, standing on his doorstep. "You must be Richard Caldwell," Martha said, her voice steadied despite her nerves. "I'm Julian's mother. I want to know what you did with my son last night." Richard was taken aback, but quickly recognized the worry in Martha's gaze. He gently invited her inside and explained everything that had happened, from Julian's request for food to their conversation. Yet the atmosphere between them grew tense as Martha's long-standing defenses kicked in. "Do you understand the assumptions people make about affluent white men and young black boys? Do you know how scared I was to see my son walking into your home alone in the middle of the night?" Martha said, her tone firm but shaking with the pain of a single mother who'd endured too much. "You won't be the first man to promise good things and turn them into a nightmare for a child of color, Mr. Caldwell." Richard hesitated, then replied slowly, "I understand your fear, Martha, but Julian is the first child to make me feel human again. I never had ill intentions toward him. I only wanted to help." Martha looked him squarely in the eyes and saw not pity or dark desire, but loneliness and a yearning to be trusted. Yet she still wasn't ready to lower her guard. "If you truly have nothing to hide, I want to see where you live for myself. I'll come here with Julian, and only when I feel safe will my son come back." "Do you agree?" she asked. Richard nodded without hesitation. "You and Julian are always welcome here. If I ever give you cause for doubt, tell me. I don't want anyone to feel afraid in this house again." Martha studied Richard for a long moment, then gave a small nod. In that instant, both realized that despite the barriers of past fear and societal prejudice, the courage to speak openly could forge a new path forward, however fraught with doubt and pain. And so the true journey of change for those once stifled by racial bias and those long isolated by privilege had taken its first tentative steps. The tense atmosphere of that morning still lingered as Martha left the manor with Julian, her heart full of doubts and confusion. Yet, true to her word, the next evening, Martha returned with her son. She couldn't deny the mixture of curiosity and unease she felt stepping through the tall iron gate into a world so different, where the cold white brick walls seemed to symbolize the distance and prejudice that had divided generations. Julian clutched his mother's hand, his eyes bright with excitement, yet wary. Martha felt her pulse quicken as they approached the front door. Richard's house was brilliantly lit, and his silhouette stood patiently in the window as if he'd been waiting for them a long time. Just as they crossed the front lawn, a luxury car pulled up beside the gate. The window rolled down to reveal Donna Montgomery, their wealthy neighbor known for her vicious remarks about those poor people of color. Donna raised an eyebrow at Martha and Julian, then sneered loudly through the open window, not bothering to hide her contempt. "Wow, Caldwell's being kind to a bunch of beggars now. What a topsy-turvy world." Her words carried across the street, catching the ears of other neighbors out for an evening stroll. A middle-aged man in an expensive coat slowed his pace to give them a scornful look. A woman nearby shook her head, whispering vicious comments about the Thomases daring to set foot in the rich folks' domain. Martha heard it all, each cruel remark like a dagger to her pride. Julian squeezed her hand tighter, his eyes flicking anxiously to his mother. But Martha lifted her chin and quietly led her son forward into the manor's doorway, her heart pounding with turmoil. She knew that a single moment of hesitation could make her child a target of the subtle aggression and hidden dangers that lurked in this place, where individuals of color were often relegated to subservient roles, never to be treated as honored guests. The door swung open to reveal Richard, his face bright with a rare warmth. He gently invited them into the living room, ignoring the hostile stares outside as a silent act of protection. Today he had prepared the room meticulously, the chairs arranged neatly, a pot of steaming tea on the table, and a small plate of cookies placed just so. An unassuming but heartfelt welcome. "Thank you for trusting me again, Martha. Hello, Julian. I'm so glad you're here." Richard began striving to ease the tension. Martha sank into a chair, her eyes still alert but noticeably softened. Julian, however, could barely contain his excitement. He darted around the room, taking everything in, then ran back to his mother and whispered, "Mama, Mr. Caldwell is so lonely. I think he needs us, and we need him too. Here, nobody calls me a nuisance." Martha's heart ached. Despite the alien and judgmental glances, Julian had found a rare peace beside this man. As Julian busied himself with the cookies, Richard turned to Martha, his eyes shining with sincerity and a touch of nervousness. "I know this may seem sudden, but I truly need someone by my side. This house is too large, too cold, and I can't manage everything on my own. I've consulted my attorney about household help, but staff rarely last. Julian has given me something I thought I'd lost faith and a sense of purpose." Martha fell silent. In Richard's gaze, she saw genuine loneliness, not pity or ulterior motives, yet bitter memories of the past made her hesitate. "Do you really think this is that simple? Aren't you afraid of the rumors out there? Afraid people will say, 'You're harboring my son for some impure reason'?" she challenged. Richard nodded slowly. "I used to live for society's approval, and it left me crippled in both body and spirit. I don't want to live that way anymore. If you'll have us, I'd like to invite you both to stay here, at least until your lives settle. I ask for nothing in return but your trust, your friendship, and if you'll allow it, a sense of family." Martha was silent for a long time. She knew this opportunity, a safe home, steady meals, a brighter future for Julian, was something she'd barely dared to dream of. Yet her pride as a poor black woman hardened by years of humiliation and scorn rose up in conflict. She recalled countless moves forced by landlords who threw her out because of her skin color, the fear of walking alone late at night with no one to protect her, the tears she'd seen in Julian's eyes when classmates excluded him. All of it swelled in her heart. Now, finally, Martha squeezed Julian's hand and looked Richard in the eye. "If you truly want to share your home, I have 3 conditions. First, Julian's needs come first. Second, I will help manage the household. We will not be freeloaders. Third, if someday you want us to leave, just tell me, and we will go with our dignity intact." Richard smiled, feeling a genuine warmth in his chest for the first time in years. Outside, the hostile stares and gossip continued, but inside that door, for the first time in a long while, 3 strangers chose to trust one another, staking their lives on a bold decision that would change their fates forever. No sooner had the manor doors closed behind them than the whispers and unhidden stares of neighbors and Richard's old acquaintances continued to echo outside. News that that black family moved into the millionaire's house spread through the upscale neighborhood like ink in clear water, and within days the undercurrents of prejudice had flooded the home, where 3 people were only beginning to build their first measure of peace. Richard, Martha, and Julian's shared life began in a swirl of strangeness. Martha awoke before dawn to oversee the estate. Julian bounded through the grand rooms, filling emptiness with the laughter of childhood. But that happy atmosphere was soon strangled by countless skeptical glances and poisonous words beyond the walls. Anonymous letters started appearing at the gate full of venomous warnings. "They'll bleed you dry. Those black folks are here to exploit you. Poor Caldwell fooled so easily. Donna and her wealthy friends openly gossiped about Richard's downfall at the country club, delighting in the fall of a man once a symbol of high society, now a laughingstock. People who once bowed to Richard now avoided him on the street, muttering derisively behind his back. Some old acquaintances even sent pointed emails about the dangers of trusting people of color. All of it left Richard discouraged, while Martha grew tense and angry, especially every time she saw her son peeking nervously through the curtains, guessing whether a police officer might call to question why a stranger was living in Richard's home. Tensions peaked one Saturday morning when Eleanor Caldwell, Richard's mother, appeared at the manor gate. Draped in an elegant coat and walking with determined steps, she swept a stern gaze across the familiar house, now transformed by the presence of two black individuals. Richard was guiding Julian through a drawing lesson in the living room when the doorbell rang. He watched his mother's face on the security monitor, her expression unreadable but tense. When he opened the door, Eleanor offered no greeting, only a cold look directed at Martha preparing breakfast in the kitchen. "Mother, this is Martha and Julian. They're guests, and now family to me," Richard said, introducing them. Eleanor didn't even glance at Martha. She turned her gaze to her son. "Richard, aren't you ashamed you've let these two strangers, different class, different color, live in this house? What were you thinking, letting them take over the kitchen your mother once tended with her own hands?" The room seemed to freeze. Martha felt her blood rise to her cheeks, but forced herself to stay calm. Julian cowered behind his mother, and Richard bowed his head, hands clenched in anxiety. "You don't understand," Richard began, but Eleanor cut him off sharply. "You've become vulnerable, my son. They'll leave you with nothing. Martha, what right do you have to live behind these walls? Do you think you deserve it?" Martha raised her head, her eyes cold but steady. "I come as a mother, a woman who works tirelessly for her child, and a person of dignity. I haven't taken a penny from Richard. I work. I'm not here begging for white people's pity. If you doubt my worth, look at how I care for this home, and look at my son's eyes, now no longer afraid each night." Eleanor was taken aback by Martha's firmness. Part of her wanted to retort, yet no valid argument came to mind. "Mrs. Caldwell," Martha continued, her voice trembling yet resolute, "I know what you think of people like me. You don't need to hide it. But I beg you, if you truly love your son, look at his happiness. The happiness that my son and I are striving to bring, not take away." The air turned stiflingly heavy. Julian gripped his mother's shirt, watching every word and movement. Richard looked from his mother to Martha, his heart torn between gratitude, wounded pride, and fear of being abandoned. For the first time, Richard refused to stay silent. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair, lifted his chin, and looked his mother in the eye. "Mother, thank you for coming, but my life here has felt dead for years. Only when Martha and Julian arrived did I remember how to feel joy, hope, and love like an ordinary person. I don't need your approval, but I won't let anyone, even you, humiliate or drive them away. This is my home, and I want them to stay." Eleanor fell silent. Her face wavered between wounded pride, sorrow, and bewilderment at her son's newfound strength. She turned away, tears glistening in eyes she tried to hide. In the small kitchen, Martha exhaled deeply. Julian wrapped his arms around his mother, and Richard turned to his family, his eyes filled with both gratitude and regret for the hardships they'd endured. But from that moment on, the walls dividing these three strangers began to crack wide open. And though the prejudice outside remained unrelenting behind those doors, a new family was taking shape, stronger and more resilient than any insult could ever destroy. The tension in Richard's house after that fierce confrontation with Eleanor had eased somewhat, though the atmosphere was no longer as pristine as it had been at the very beginning, and nor was it as stifling as before. Even though prejudice still ran rampant outside, a quiet sprout of tranquility had begun to form behind those doors. Martha moved quietly about her chores. Julian chatted happily with Richard, and Richard, for the first time in years, began to look forward to those fleeting moments spent with the two of them. With his boundless energy and innocent faith, Julian had breathed new life into Richard's world. Every morning he would knock on his door, bubbling over with strange dreams he'd had, or tug him into the garden to try lifting your leg a little just for fun. At first, Richard would laugh it off, assuming it was a child's game from someone who could never understand an adult's despair. But strangely, each time Julian gently touched his knee, each time he patiently massaged his calf, he felt something different. A gentle hum at first, then a subtle warmth, and even a brief pinch of pain, just like the years when his legs still served him. One night, lying in bed, he felt his foot twitch ever so slightly, the first sensation in nearly 15 years. He thought he must be dreaming. The next morning, Julian watched him quietly, then grinned mysteriously. "I told you the wonder is real if you dare to believe." Martha stood behind them, moved yet fearful. Happiness had never come easily for her. She managed the household in silence, endured the vexing phone calls, and bore the hushed calumnies with patience. Yet when she saw Richard beginning to lift his leg under her son's encouragement, she understood that hope, even the most fragile kind, could still save a person. After a week, Richard decided to undergo another neurological exam, partly to reassure Martha, partly because he feared he might be experiencing nothing more than a happy hallucination. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned neurologist who had followed his case for years, greeted him with a look that was half sympathy, half weariness. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm surprised to see you so soon. What's on your mind?" Dr. Reed asked, dusting off her decades-old files. Richard hesitated, then described the strange sensations, the vivid dreams, the moments his legs seemed to wake up. Dr. Reed proceeded with careful reflex tests and an MRI scan. During the exam, her eyes flicked several times toward Martha and Julian waiting in the hallway, an expression of suspicion and thinly veiled mistrust on her face. An hour later, Evelyn delivered her verdict. "Your neural pathways do show signs of measurable regeneration. I've never seen anything like this in my career. However, I can't rule out a psychological component. These improvements might stem from suggestion, or I'm sorry to ask, but has anyone been altering your medication or treatment protocol?" Richard blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Dr. Reed fixed her gaze on Martha, then on Julian. "I have to ask. Some families or caretakers have been known to manufacture false signs of improvement for personal gain or to control assets. I know this sounds extreme, but with wealthy patients, such things can happen. Are you fully in control of your medication and finances, Mr. Caldwell?" The room grew heavy with tension. Martha's cheeks flushed with a mix of shame and anger. Julian looked up at the doctor, innocent and unaware of the implication behind her words. Richard took a slow breath and replied, his voice cold. "I oversee everything. Martha never touches my meds, and Julian is just a child." Though still doubtful, Dr. Reed could not refute the test results. "Regardless, this is highly unusual. I'll continue to monitor you, and if you don't mind, I'd like to bring in independent experts for a second opinion." Richard agreed, but a surge of indignation and humiliation welled up inside him. He thought of all that Martha and Julian had already endured, and now he too was being pulled into society's poisonous circle of suspicion whenever someone crossed class lines. What no one knew was that this very examination would spark a brewing storm. A nurse casually remarking on Richard's miraculous recovery confided in an acquaintance, none other than Deborah Caldwell's secretary. Deborah, once the epitome of high society, now struggling financially after the divorce, saw her chance. In her mind, Richard's kindness had been naive, and Martha and Julian's presence in the manor, a sinister ploy to seize his estate. Wasting no time, Deborah hired a lawyer gathering evidence to launch a legal offensive under the guise of protecting her vulnerable, disabled ex-husband from predatory opportunists of color. Outside, the winds of prejudice and personal interest were gathering strength. But in those final days of autumn at the Caldwell estate, Julian still came each morning to Richard's side, gently placing his small hand on his knee and whispering, "Today, let's try lifting your leg again. Wonders require a bit of courage." And amid all the doubts, Richard dared to hope not only for the return of his own legs, but for the future of this extraordinary family. News of the Caldwell wonder dominated the tabloids overnight. Secret snapshots of Richard with Martha and Julian taken from the garden were splashed across the front pages under cruel headlines. "Immobilized millionaire hypnotized by mysterious black boy. Ex-wife warns, don't let yourself be ruined by those street kids." The papers gleefully dug into Martha's poverty and skin color, twisting the facts to satisfy the public's malicious curiosity. Within days, a thick lawsuit arrived at the manor. Deborah Caldwell claiming to protect her ex-husband's assets, and mental health petitioned the court to freeze Richard's property and accused Martha and Julian of brainwashing, emotional manipulation, and misrepresenting his medical condition. Deborah's lawyer publicly declared, "We will expose every conspiracy aimed at profiting from a patient, especially when it involves exploiting trust across class and racial lines." Those cold words and vicious insinuations were like knives twisting into Martha's already fragile dignity. Night after night, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Harassing calls, threats from anonymous strangers, even trash packages and hate mail dropped at their gate. Terrified, Julian asked his mother, "Is it because I'm black that people hate me?" Martha could only hold her son in silent tears of helpless shame. Richard, pained and furious, struggled to stay calm. He spent hours beside Julian, encouraging him to draw, read books, and tell stories to soothe his fears. At night, he and Martha would sit together by the dark window for hours, sharing their years of loneliness, their fear of being cast aside, and above all, their resolve not to let the past or anyone's prejudice dictate their happiness. The more the public turned against them, the more Martha wanted to shield her son from the storm. One evening, after Richard had escorted Eleanor to her car, Martha gently said, "Maybe Julian and I should leave Richard. You've already endured so much pressure because of us. All the things people are saying, I'm afraid they're true. I'm scared Julian will hate his own skin color when he grows up." Richard took Martha's hand, his voice calm but firm. "Don't you see, Martha? They only hate what they don't understand. If we leave, they win. They'll prove that public pressure difference and skin color are enough to tear apart a family. I've lived 15 years trapped by my own fears. I won't let Julian inherit fear from the world outside." Martha shook her head, tears silently falling. She'd never believed a white man would dare to defend her against the whole world. But now, faced with Richard's unwavering sincerity, she felt something transcend race, understanding responsibility and love. Just when it seemed they were at their weakest, Eleanor Caldwell, the very woman who had fiercely opposed Martha, and Julian began to change. Quietly, she observed Martha overseeing the residence, caring for her son's meals and rest, patiently sitting with Julian as he studied, played, and learned right from wrong. She never caught a hint of deceit or cunning that Deborah had accused them of. Instead, Eleanor realized the truth. For years, she had viewed the world through a lens of privilege, judging the less fortunate by the color of their skin, not by who they really were. One late evening, Eleanor called Martha into the backyard where she was tending the plants. "Martha," she began, her tone still reserved but gentler now. I'm sorry for misjudging you. I believed Deborah's lies that you were exploiting Richard for his fortune. But I've seen enough to understand that without you and Julian, my son would still be just a shadow of himself, trapped in loneliness and anger for 2 decades. Martha said nothing, but her eyes shone with gratitude. Eleanor continued, "I'm going to speak with the family lawyer. I'll do everything I can to protect Richard and to protect you and Julian. What Deborah is doing is unacceptable. The world needs to hear the truth from those who live it." From that night on, a quiet alliance formed in the manor. 3 adults of different ages, backgrounds, and skin colors, and 1 small boy. They were no longer merely battling society's prejudice. They had become a true family, believing that the only real wonder wasn't a healed pair of legs, but compassion and unity. Outside, Deborah and the press continued their smear campaign. But inside those doors, for the first time in years, the true meaning of family began to shine through a bond stronger than any accusation, any prejudice, any difference. And in that still glow of hope, Martha knew she had been right not to let go. Ever since Eleanor began to take her side, Martha felt she'd gained a real ally in the manor. What she didn't know was that even within these familiar walls, a silent darkness lurked embodied in the one person Richard had trusted above all, Clara. For nearly 30 years, Clara had been the loyal housekeeper to the Caldwells. She'd quietly witnessed every twist and turn of their family's life, caring for Richard from his rebellious adolescence through the darkest days of his despair. Yet, living all those years in this wealthy neighborhood had imbued Clara with deep-seated prejudice against anyone different, especially poor people of color. Clara had never liked Martha or Julian, though she always wore a polite expression. Whenever Eleanor praised Martha's devotion or marveled at Julian's purity, Clara's expression would subtly tighten, and her gaze would betray a veiled disdain. In her mind, the Thomases' presence was a stain on the Caldwell legacy. It was Clara who first approached Deborah Caldwell when she heard Deborah was gathering dirt on Martha. Loyal to the Caldwells and resentful at seeing outsiders occupy her old domain, Clara exceeded her duties as housekeeper. She contacted Deborah's lawyer and willingly shared partial truths and outright falsehoods. Martha rummaged through Richard's office. She alleged Julian eavesdropped on private discussions. Martha has been prying into the estate's financial records. None of it had any proof, but it swelled Deborah's lawsuit file and ignited a fresh wave of public outrage. One Monday morning, Martha slipped into the storage room and heard Clara's voice on the phone in the back garden. At first, she turned to leave, but then phrases like exploiting his kindness, Caldwell family assets, and outsiders shouldn't stay long stopped her in her tracks. She crept closer to the doorway and heard Clara say, "I told you Deborah Martha isn't as innocent as she seems. First, she came begging for leftovers, and now she's clinging to Richard's wealth. I see it all. If you need more details, I'll keep feeding them to your lawyer." Martha's hand clenched into a fist, tears burning her cheeks with anger and humiliation. She remembered every cold glance from Clara, every sly insinuation, every polite but empty refusal behind Clara's smile. Now it was clear the woman Richard trusted most was stabbing them in the back. That evening, Martha stayed silent until Julian was sound asleep. Then she went into the kitchen, where Clara was wiping down counters, and spoke with quiet resolve. "Clara, what have you been telling Deborah? Why invent lies about me and Julian? Do you think I wouldn't hear?" Clara looked up without changing expression. "I'm only stating facts, Martha. The Caldwell family has been far too generous to you. No one wants this house turned into a mess by people unworthy of it. I'm preserving Richard's legacy, and you should know your place." Martha's hands trembled with rage, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "You know I have never touched anything that didn't belong to me. I only ever try to do my work honestly and protect my son from the very prejudices you're spreading. Do you even realize how much harm you've caused?" The confrontation grew more tense when Richard happened to walk by and caught the end of their exchange. He froze in the doorway, eyes wide looking between the two women to whom he owed so much, each in a different way. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Martha turned to him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Clara has been feeding Deborah information to bolster her lawsuit, spreading lies about me and Julian. She's doing it not to protect you, but because she hates us for being black." Clara did not flinch. Her eyes blazed with stubborn anger. "I'm doing what's necessary to protect the family's inheritance. Richard, can't you see? She'll strip you of everything?" Richard stood rooted to the spot. For decades, Clara had been his closest confidant after his mother. She attended to his wounds, both physical and emotional, when the world abandoned him. But now he could not deny the truth. Martha's words had peeled away all his lingering doubts that long-standing loyalty could be driven by fear of difference, by unconscious bigotry soaked into one's bones. The room fell into a heavy silence. Richard lowered his head, torn between past bonds and present reality, between a lifelong caretaker and the new family he had fought so hard to protect. Finally, he lifted his gaze and spoke to Clara in the cool, firm tone of a true head of household. "Clara, I thank you for all the years you've cared for this family, but I cannot tolerate any prejudice, any slander, or any betrayal within my home. If you cannot live in this family under these terms, I must let you go. This decision is not only for Martha and Julian, it is for me. I choose to live by my conscience." Clara was struck silent, her elderly eyes filling with tears. She knew in that moment that everything had changed forever. That night, for the first time in years, Richard sat long by the dark window, mourning the fragment of his past he had lost, yet feeling a strange peace in knowing he had finally chosen the side of justice and the truth of his own heart. After a night spent wrestling with the ghosts of his past, Richard woke to a heavy heart. The manor felt strangely silent without Clara's familiar footsteps. Only memories and faint echoes of laughter remained reminders of all the trials they had faced together. He realized he hadn't just cut loose a piece of his childhood. He'd brought an end to an old era, an era in which prejudice, even when wrapped in loyalty, served as an invisible jail for the human heart. That morning, he summoned Clara to his sunlit study. Richard noted how much she'd aged since their first meeting. "Clara," he said softly, "I know you believed you were protecting me and my family, but your fear and prejudice have hurt innocent people. No one in this house can be truly happy if we harbor hate. I'm grateful for your years of service, but as of today, I must say goodbye. You deserve to spend the rest of your life somewhere that brings you peace and honors your worth." Clara said nothing, bowed her head, and slipped away in silence, tears glistening in her eyes. Tears of someone caught between two worlds. Richard stood at the window long after she was gone, feeling both a pang of sorrow and a lightness of relief. He knew this was the right decision, not just to protect Martha and Julian, but to free himself from the toxic cycles of his past. Yet beyond the manor walls, the storm raged on. Deborah's lawsuit had officially landed in court, transforming what was once a private family quarrel into a high-profile legal spectacle covered by the press. Editors and pundits competed to portray Richard, the immobilized spouse and supposed target of a prejudiced plot, and Martha, the enigmatic woman depicted as a callous opportunist. Every act of kindness that Martha and Julian had shown Richard was twisted into fodder for social media outrage, fanning the embers of racial animus. In the courtroom, Deborah arrived in elegant defiance, flanked by a battalion of lawyers. She paraded Clara's accusations of Martha's shady dealings, produced financial records, and doctored images to sully the mother and son's reputations, and declaimed at length about her duty to protect her ex-husband, the pain of someone who once shared Richard's life, and the dangers a vulnerable man faces when manipulated by outsiders. When Richard took the stand, he faced a barrage of nasty questions. Did you sign over property under Martha's threat? Has young Julian accessed your private documents? Have you ever suspected emotional manipulation? Calmly, Richard replied, I sign nothing without full awareness and unwavering trust. No one coerced or manipulated me. The only gift I received is life itself, a gift I thought lost to me for 15 years. Tension peaked when Deborah's lawyer asked that 7-year-old Julian, his wide, innocent eyes, be called as a witness. The courtroom fell eerily silent. Martha gripped her son's hand, fear etched on her face. But Julian surprised everyone, climbing onto the stand with quiet courage. He greeted the judge with a small smile and answered each question with surprising poise. Julian, the lawyer asked, do you know why you're here? Julian glanced around, his eyes bright. They said my mom and I did something bad to Mr. Caldwell, but I don't understand. He's my friend. I just help him be happy, and every day we try to help him remember how to walk. A hush fell over the room. The lawyer pressed on. Have you ever taken anything from Mr. Caldwell? Has your mother instructed you to snoop? Julian shook his head earnestly. No, sir. Mama told me to always ask first. I only offer Mr. Caldwell drawings. I think drawings make people happier than money. The judge softened. Do you love Mr. Caldwell? He asked. Julian nodded, eyes shining. I love him so much. He used to be sad like my mom and me, but now he knows how to laugh. Everyone here calls us outsiders, but Mr. Caldwell calls my mom a friend, and he calls me his young healer. Quiet laughter and tears rippled through the gallery. Julian's simple words struck a chord even among the reporters who had spread falsehoods. They began to see the story not through suspicion, but through the eyes of a child who only wanted to give and receive love. Finally, the judge ruled, there is no evidence that Martha and Julian exploited or harmed Mr. Caldwell. On the contrary, the court finds they have provided him significant emotional and physical benefit. Miss Deborah Caldwell's case is dismissed. The Caldwell family is free to continue their lives. Outside, the public buzzed over Julian's testimony. Headlines shifted from mockery to celebration of resilience, faith, and the small wonders born of human kindness. Letters of support, bouquets of flowers, and messages of apology poured into the manor. Richard knew there were still challenges ahead, but trust the invisible treasure he'd lost for 2 decades had finally triumphed thanks to the love of a little black boy and a woman who refused to surrender to prejudice. And in that moment, Richard understood that it was not legs nor money, but faith in decency that holds the true power to resurrect a soul. After Julian's moving testimony, the courtroom fell into an almost unbelievable hush. Those who had criticized and doubted him were now silent, listening, and a flicker of empathy appeared in their eyes. Martha sat quietly in the gallery, tears welling, not from pain, but from pride and joy at seeing her little boy speak up for their entire family. And Richard felt something unlock in his chest, a part of his soul long imprisoned by fear, hurt, and shame. The lawsuit pressed on. Deborah and her attorneys refused to relent, continually producing new documents and so-called evidence to paint Richard as the victim of an elaborate psychological scheme masterminded by Martha and Julian. The media buzzed again, ready to pivot at a moment's notice for the next sensational headline. But this time, the tide was turning. That day, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The judge ordered a public medical demonstration with independent experts and reporters in attendance. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the neurologist who had followed Richard's case for nearly 15 years, was called to the stand. Evelyn, long skeptical of any Caldwell wonder, had to revise her views after witnessing his undeniable progress and surprising medical indicators. Before the bench, she declared firmly, "Initially, I believed Mr. Caldwell's improvements might stem from psychological effects or suggestion, but recent exams confirm real, medically remarkable recovery in his motor function and neural reflexes. There is no sign of medication tampering or fraudulent treatment. I can't explain how it happened, but it is fact." An independent neurologist echoed her findings, pointing to the MRI scans. The patient's nervous system has reestablished its basic connections. In our field, this is a truly unique case. Deborah's lawyer scoffed. "So, doctor, should we believe in wonders or in the fairy tale spun by a 7-year-old? Dr. Reed replied, visibly moved. "I present the scientific truth, yet sometimes love, trust, and the will to live are forces science can't fully measure." A hush of astonishment fell over the room. Richard, who had remained quiet through every accusation, now faced the judge's request to stand. Martha gripped Julian's hand. Eleanor covered her mouth, silently praying. Richard placed his hands on the chair arms and closed his eyes, gathering the strength of 2 decades of pain. A deep breath. Every gaze in the courtroom fixed on him. The man long deemed permanently disabled. He tensed, feeling a familiar numbness up his spine. But this time, there was no shame or fear. He opened his eyes and glimpsed Julian's encouraging nod. Richard smiled. Then, trembling but determined, he lifted himself up. Inch by inch, he rose to the gasps of everyone present. The room seemed to choke on silence. Then he drew in a deep breath, took the assistant's hand, and took his first shaky step. Another step. A ripple of astonishment surged into spontaneous applause. Cameras flashed nonstop as reporters sprinted forward. It was real. Martha sobbed with relief. Julian ran to hug his legs. Eleanor's tears flowed freely. The judge smiled and rapped his gavel. "This is not only a legal victory, but a triumph of faith and human will." The judge dismissed Deborah's case, preserving Richard's civil rights and property. No evidence of fraud or exploitation was found. Immediately, the media tone shifted from scorn to admiration, celebrating Richard's resilience, Martha and Julian's courage, and the boundless love of this special family. Dressed in a neat suit, Julian stood tall, amid strangers, the living emblem of pure faith, a wonder that compelled society to reconsider itself. Schools and community groups launched campaigns for equality and anti-racism, adopting the Caldwell's story as their rallying cry. That evening, in the familiar manner, Richard, Martha, Julian, and Eleanor sat together by candlelight. Richard whispered, "We've won more than a lawsuit. We've conquered the darkness of prejudice. This family was born from the wonder of faith." Martha smiled and squeezed his hand. Julian, resting his head in Eleanor's lap, whispered, "Tomorrow I'll teach Mr. Caldwell how to play catch." They all laughed as a spring breeze drifted through the windows, carrying hope of a truly new beginning. Laughter and joy from that legal victory still echoed through the Caldwell manor on that first spring evening after the trial. Richard, Martha, Julian, and Eleanor gathered together, unwilling to break the strange peace that had settled over them. The 4 of them, once strangers, once standing on opposite sides of society, had now become a unique family bound by understanding courage and love that transcended every prejudice. The next morning, as the first sunlight turned the garden gold, Richard awoke earlier than usual. He practiced walking down the hallway, feeling each step not alone anymore and no longer weighed by despair. Martha was watering the flower pots Julian had planted by hand, while the little boy chirped to Eleanor about his drawings of a happy family. After breakfast, Richard lingered at the kitchen doorway and watched Martha intently. His eyes no longer held the darkness of a man burdened by shame and hurt, but instead the light of someone who had rediscovered faith, love, and purpose. "Martha," Richard said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I've never had the courage to say this, but I love you. Not just because you saved my legs, but because you saved my soul. Because you believed in me when the world had turned away and taught me what a real family looks like." Martha paused, tears quietly falling down her cheeks. She said nothing, only smiled, her heart brimming with happiness and emotion. Richard took her hand and knelt right there in the breakfast nook. For the first time in 15 years, he made the boldest move of his life. "Will you wed me, Martha Thomas?" he whispered, a simple proposal that carried the weight of a lifetime of searching. Julian, accidentally witnessing the moment, squealed with delight. He ran forward to hug his mother and Richard, while Eleanor hovered at the doorway, wiping away tears, partly regretful, partly proud that her son had finally found true happiness. That very day, Eleanor sought out Martha and Julian as they tended the small vegetable patch. She hesitated, her gaze seeming to reflect on years of her own past. "Martha, Julian," Eleanor began in a voice softer and more genuine than ever before. I want to apologize to both of you. Perhaps I judged you too harshly, viewed you through the lens of my past and the unrecognized privilege I held. I let fear and pride cloud my judgment and treated people who only wanted love poorly." Martha squeezed her son's shoulder, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you for saying that, Eleanor. I understand. Everyone has their own fears. What matters is that you found the courage to see us differently and choose to stand with us." Eleanor gently stooped and hugged Julian, the little boy she had once doubted and alienated. "From now on, I will protect both of you just as I have always protected Richard," she whispered. Julian looked up and hugged Eleanor tightly, his smile reflecting rare happiness. Within days, news of Richard and Martha's engagement had spread throughout the community. Surprisingly, instead of protest or backlash, most of Richard's old neighbors and friends began to change their tone. Many sent flowers, congratulatory cards, and heartfelt apologies after the trial. Some even publicly expressed support on social media, admitting they had been wrong to heed blind prejudice. The local nonprofit reached out to Martha, inviting her to collaborate on projects supporting disadvantaged women and children. Schools requested Julian share his account of the wonder of faith and courage, making the little black boy a new symbol of overcoming discrimination. As the wedding day approached, the Caldwell Manor buzzed with laughter. Julian and Eleanor chose wedding decorations. Martha tried on her dress with the help of new friends. Richard, no longer the lonely millionaire, busied himself with the guest list, insisting that everyone who had turned their back on the family be invited as a declaration everyone deserves the chance to change. On the night before the wedding, Martha and Richard sat together in the garden where the moonlight fell over the tiny flowers Julian had grown. Richard looked at his bride-to-be and whispered, "We've endured so many storms, so much pain, tears, and the hatred of people once called our friends. But perhaps because of all that, you and Julian became the true wonders of my life." Martha rested her head on his shoulder and smiled. "And you taught us that sometimes a wonder isn't something grand, but simply the chance to live and be loved like ordinary people." The next morning, the entire community gathered before the Caldwell Manor. No one dared make remarks about skin color, background, or status. Everyone rose to applaud as Richard took Martha's hand and led her down the aisle. No wheelchair, no shame. Julian, beaming in his neat suit, walked ahead as the ring bearer. The Caldwell narrative became a fresh emblem of faith and compassion. There was no more division, only laughter, joy, and the admiration of a once distant community. That day, as the church bells rang and white petals danced in the breeze, Martha knew at last she had a family. Not just a shared roof, but a safe haven where love could take root and grow, undeterred by any barrier of skin color or past. The church bells rang out across a brilliant spring morning, heralding not only a moment the three residents of the Caldwell Manor had dreamed of, but a wake-up call for the entire community. Today, Martha, in her simple yet pure wedding gown, walked hand in hand with Richard, the man who had once despaired that he'd never stand again, as they took steady steps along the old tiled aisle of the grand church. Every gaze following them was no longer one of suspicion, but admiration, respect, and even remorse. Little Julian, proud in his white ring-bearer suit, gently scattered petals ahead of them. His radiant smile, as bright as the morning sun, embodied innocence, bravery, and unshakable faith. Behind him, Eleanor guided the older guests with a beaming, proud expression. They were a family now, not defined by blood alone, but forged by overcoming the deepest fractures of prejudice, fear, and mistrust. The ceremony itself was simple, yet overflowing with emotion. No one sat still as Richard, needing no wheelchair, stepped forward to escort Martha down the aisle. A hushed reverence enveloped the room before bursting into applause and heartfelt sobs from those who had witnessed their tear-streaked journey. When it came time for his vows, Richard looked into Martha's eyes, eyes that held the weight of past hurts, regret, gratitude, and above all, profound appreciation for the woman who had weathered every storm with him. His voice was slow, clear, and resonant, touching the hearts of everyone present. Today, before God and all of you, I declare this love and trust are the true wonders of my life. Some say my ability to walk again is a marvel of medicine, but I know the greater wonder is learning to see beyond myself, rising above fear, breaking through invisible barriers our society has long imposed. I once let prejudice, shame, and loneliness paralyze my soul more completely than any physical injury ever could. Yet through Martha, through Julian, through Eleanor, and through everyone courageous enough to confront their own biases, I've learned that the greatest wonder is to be believed in, forgiven, and loved. He scanned the pews, finding faces that had once sneered or doubted, now wearing tentative smiles of empathy. I hope that from this small story, each of us will learn to open our hearts to apologize, to make amends, and to give second chances to those we once excluded because of their background or skin color. Let us never allow fear or hatred to steal away the wonder that every human being deserves. Martha squeezed Richard's hand, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. Julian stood below, clutching his tiny drawing, his eyes shining with joy, fully aware that he had become both participant and witness to this extraordinary wonder of acceptance. When the service ended, the congregation streamed outside the church. For the first time, former critics, neighbors, old colleagues, even stern Donna Montgomery stepped forward to shake hands and embrace Martha and Richard, offering heartfelt apologies. They spoke of their earlier doubts and gossip and confessed that they had been moved by the Caldwells' unwavering faith and determination. Eleanor, unable to hold back her tears, declared to waiting reporters, "I once lived in pride and hidden fear cloaked in outdated prejudices. Now I pledge to be a protector of this new family and to work with all of you to build a community and a society that no longer tolerates bias." The story went national. Schools and nonprofits adopted images of Julian and Martha for equality campaigns. An image of Julian leading Richard down the decorated aisle with Martha beaming at their side went viral, shared millions of times with the message, "Wonders aren't found in the color of one's skin, but in the colors of our trust." Back at the Caldwell Manor that evening, the atmosphere felt like a festival. New friends and neighbors who had changed their hearts gathered in the blooming garden. Julian weaved through them, chuckling occasionally, pausing at Eleanor's side to share new wonders he hoped the world would witness. As night fell, Richard held Martha and Julian on the terrace, gazing at a starlit sky. He knew that their joy belonged not just to their family, but glowed as hope for many others that all wounds can heal if we dare to love, humble ourselves to change, and believe enough to forgive. Their story would stand as a lasting reminder to the community. Only trust and love can truly mend every fracture, even the most enduring barriers of racial prejudice. And only when we each dare to admit our mistakes and extend the wonder of kindness will society become truly fair and compassionate. In the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves and Julian's gleeful laughter echoing into the evening, everyone knew the real wonder had arrived, not in walking again, but in hearts learning to love and forgive. And so, a new chapter began, summed up in two simple words: family. The story of Richard, Martha, Julian, and Eleanor reminds us that healing doesn't always come from medicine, but from love, compassion, and the courage to see one another beyond the barriers of race, status, or pain. It shows us that even in the darkest places, the smallest light, sometimes in the shape of a child's hand, can guide a soul back to life. What would you have done if you were in Richard's place or Martha's? Have you ever felt misunderstood or judged because of where you come from or what you carry in your heart? If this story touched something in you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe your words will comfort someone else. And if you'd like to walk with us through more stories like this, stories of hope, change, and quiet courage, please subscribe to the channel. Your presence here helps us create a kinder, more understanding world. Thank you for listening and for being part of this journey with us.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.